There was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections, Jim?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rackets podcast. This is Brian Sadie. On this podcast, we cover all the different types of rackets in the world, everything from organized crime and drug trafficking to crony capitalism. And this is really a subject today that will kind of touch upon many of those, and it's really sort of the state of perpetual war. And I have a fantastic guest. His name's Nathan Smith. He's a former Army captain and an intelligence officer at the command headquarters in Kuwait. Most notably, he filed a federal lawsuit back in 2016 against the President of the United States, challenging the legality of the wars in Syria and Iraq. So welcome to the show, Nathan.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
I definitely want to talk about this lawsuit that you filed, but I think it'd just kind of be interesting for the audience to kind of get basically like a little bit of a better understanding about you and your background. So I was kind of hoping maybe you could tell us why you joined the military, a little bit about that decision.
Yeah, so I'm actually from a family that's 3 generations of military officers. My grandfather, who's still alive, 96, he's a World War II veteran fighter pilot, Navy officer. My mother was a Navy officer. My father was a Navy officer. My uncle, my sister served briefly as a naval officer. So military service runs pretty deep in my family. And when I went to college, I decided I wanted to do Army ROTC. I kind of broke the tradition of not going Navy in my family. For me, it was partially a thing that the aspect of us being a country at war. At that time, we were, in Iraq and Afghanistan. I really wanted to be in. If I was going to contribute, I wanted to be in the service where you're really put most at the forefront of what's going on, because I felt like that was the best way for me to see and understand and really contribute, as an individual. Obviously, that's not to detract from any of the other services, which obviously all play super key roles in supporting the mission. So I joined ROTC. I commissioned as a second lieutenant in 2010 the ROTC program was out of San Diego State. I graduated from University of San Diego, so it was a crosstown program. And I commissioned as an artillery officer. And I did 3.5 years of artillery, and then switched over to intelligence when I made captain. Right around then, they switched the branch for me there, and I was trained as an intel officer there in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. So I did one deployment in 2012 for 8 months to Afghanistan, to northern Kunar province on the Pakistan border. Again, as an artillery officer, I was on it's called an SFAT team, which is an advisory team. We advised the Afghan border police. So that was an interesting experience. And then in 2015, I was assigned as an intelligence officer this time to 3 Corps headquarters in Fort Hood, Texas, which is the headquarters for the 3-star general. And there at Fort Hood, who's the ranking officer at Fort Hood, and the Corps commander. And we came down on deployment orders to go to Kuwait to set up. Well, there was already a headquarters set up there that was overseeing the fight. At that time, it was basically just in Iraq. But they wanted a command headquarters to oversee and coordinate efforts there. And there was one that was already existing at that time, but it was kind of ad hoc put together from a bunch of different elements. So they wanted to have a cohesive, already existent Corps headquarters take over that mission. So I deployed in August of 2015 on a 12-month deployment to Kuwait. And I worked on the operations floor as an intelligence analyst and ops officer. So I managed a small team of about five other soldiers, along with my NCO, my non-commissioned officer, sergeant, and we provided briefs and did all the normal stuff that you would expect on an operations floor. So that's kind of my background, is in summary, I guess.
Okay. So what you've done was really bold, basically, as far as I can tell, unprecedented. If you don't mind, do you mind explaining basically really the sort of the nuts and bolts of your lawsuit that you filed against them?
Yeah. So basically, on a personal level, how I kind of came to this juncture with this lawsuit was when I deployed in August of 2015. At that time, it was obviously President Obama was in office, and the Congress was controlled by the Republican Party. And so it was basically, widely accepted that the mission that was going on to counter ISIS there in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, was a necessary mission. I mean, that was basically common, the sort of the common thought process in Washington, D.C. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that or not. I'm just saying that was sort of what the political class was thinking at the time. So there was a lot of discussion with, is Congress going to officially authorize American troops to go into both Iraq and then, of course, like Kuwait, where I was, because to oversee the mission. And at that time, the Republican Party was saying that they were essentially in favor of this, but they didn't want to vote for a bunch of political reasons, basically, sparring between President Obama and them. They didn't want to provide him that authority until they got some assurances as to what the mission was going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So the situation that we ended up having was that in 2015, when I deployed, the conflict had already been going on with U.S. troops involved for about a year at that point. And yet in that year time frame, Congress had not voted to authorize the mission. So per the War Powers Act of the post-Vietnam War Powers Resolution that was passed, there's very strict stipulations on timeline for if a president is going to send American troops into combat or to support combat operations even of another country. Like, he needs to get a congressional approval for that. And I won't go into the specifics too much of that law because my legal team did that obviously ad nauseum in our lawsuit. But bottom line is, it was the interpretation of a lot of legal scholars at the time and kind of intellectuals that President Obama was in violation of the law of the War Powers Resolution in the way that he had sent troops in without congressional authorization. And, it's important to point out, usually in the modern era, that authorization comes in the form of what they call an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force. So, for instance, President Bush, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, he got a congressional authorization from Congress and an AUMF allowing him to do that. And after 9/11, there was an AUMF passed, which famously only one member of Congress in both the House and the Senate voted against, and that was Representative Barbara Lee from California, which was extremely brave political move at the time. But that post 9/11 AUMF, I think it's like 40 words long, and it authorizes the president to go after essentially the perpetrators of 9/11. And it's pretty broad language, but it's not all encompassing language. It really isn't a blank check, or it wasn't, even the way it was written, which was, I think, deeply flawed. It doesn't, no one at the time, I don't think, thought it constituted a blank check for a president.
Right.
So basically, at the time I deployed, there was no AUMF that had been passed specific to this conflict, because we had pulled troops out of Iraq in 2011. It's important to note the Obama administration had, and Susan Rice had written a letter to Congress stating that it was the view of the administration that the conflict that had been authorized by the 2003 AUMF was now over, and the administration was now not going to use that AUMF for legal justification going forward. So essentially, the Obama administration a few years earlier had already said, we're done with that AUMF. So again, it's important to note there's two AUMFs. There's the 2001 post 9/11 one, and then there's the 2003 Iraq War AUMF. So they're saying the Iraq War AUMF is finitum, it's done. Which is interesting because in our lawsuit, as the Department of Justice was contesting our lawsuit later down the road, they actually made the completely nonsensical argument that the 2001 AUMF covered this conflict, so the president didn't need a separate vote from Congress with a new AUMF, but anything that wasn't covered by that post 9/11 AUMF was covered by the 2003 AUMF. Well, that makes absolutely no sense when this is from an administration that's arguing that they've already rescinded that. So this is the kind of nonsense that we're getting from the Department of Justice throughout our court case, throughout this multi-year process that the court case went. But it's just indicative of how the deck is stacked against any plaintiff on any kind of national security type lawsuit over the last, basically 20 years, and just how deferential to the executive the judiciary has become, because they can just throw out this utter garbage of legal arguments and somehow it's sufficient.
It really is amazing how on such an important matter, it's just, I don't even know how to say it. I'm kind of like at a loss for words. It just kind of blows my mind. Again, matters of war, it's just sort of this basic like trivial response by the DOJ. Again, you're not questioning whether even these are a good idea to do it. You're just saying the legality of the issue.
Right.
Stance.
So the reason that I personally felt the need to be the plaintiff in this case was, well, first let me I guess explain how I kind of came to that point. So I deployed in 2015. And at the time I deployed, Congress was going back and forth, and they were saying, okay, we're going to pass an AUMF, essentially. There's going to be one in the next several months. There's going to be one in the next several months. And the goalpost just keeps shifting.
Right.
First it was, we're about to have Paul Ryan take over as speaker. He's really going to settle down the House, and we're going to get this business done. Everything's going to settle down. We'll get the AUMF passed then. So he takes over, nothing happens. Then there was always something cooking, but nothing ever getting cooked. I was watching this and I was deeply troubled because, in my view, when you commission as an officer in the military, you take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Above all else, that's what you're swearing to do. Now, you agree to obey the orders of the officers appointed over you, and obviously the president being first among them. But really, in my view, when I was taking that oath, and what I grew up hearing from my parents and inside my own family, which again is 3 generations of military service, is you are supporting a system of government, and you need to believe in that system of government and really think that that's what you want to do when you take that oath. And that's what I did when I stood in 2010 and in San Diego and raised my right hand, and with 20 other people, we were commissioned as second lieutenants in the Army. I took that very seriously. But so to me, when I'm seeing something happening and it's a complete breakdown of the system and the constitutional system, obviously Congress is the branch that declares war in our Constitution. So there's been no declaration of war, there's been no AUMF, and yet I'm receiving a deployment order from the Obama administration to go into this conflict. That's an anathema to my oath that I took.
Right.
So anyway, again, there's a lot of legal scholars that were concerned about this, and one in particular. So I was reading a lot of stuff while I was downrange and kind of just before I left, and one in particular kind of stood out, and that was Professor Bruce Ackerman from Yale Law School, who's been a longtime critic of sort of encroaching executive power, especially with regard to war power. And he wrote a piece in The Atlantic in which he essentially outlined and templated a lawsuit where a person serving in the military that was engaged actively in the conflict in Iraq or Syria would sue in federal court because he said such a person would have legal standing to bring that case, whereas like a member of Congress would not, because there's some case law stating essentially that they don't have legal standing in that. But there was case law from the Vietnam War that Professor Ackerman thought, and I won't go down into all that stuff, but basically there was some legal precedent from some draftees in the Vietnam era who had received deployment orders and then sued, basically saying the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was illegal or whatever. So we were basically using some of that existing case law along with the very clear language of the War Powers Resolution to say, hey, this is not legal. This is not a legal deployment order. And since every deployment order ultimately originates with the president, obviously it's communicated through the Secretary of Defense, but it originates with the president's authority through the executive branch. The plaintiff or on the other side had to be President Obama and then subsequently President Trump. So that's kind of the gist of kind of what got me there and the concerns that I had and everything that I basically reached out to Ackerman and said, I will be the plaintiff in this lawsuit. And I had to wait a while because I was going through some family stuff. My mother was terminally ill, so I was not going to do it until she passed away. Which really bothered me, but I ultimately, when she passed away, I called him and said, okay, I'm ready to do this. And so it went from there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that probably was the right decision. I imagine, even though, again, this was a principled stance, you had to face some backlash when you made this decision.
Yeah, it was the whole story of kind of like everything that happened inside that headquarters after all this went down was pretty kind of epic, at least for me as the person that it's happening to. But the military is obviously a very conservative organization, not conservative. I don't mean in the sense politically, but in action. There's not generally like radical actions taken inside the military on policy stuff like this. And at first glance, I think a lot of people have a hard time reconciling with somebody suing their commander in chief. And I understand that. Again, I grew up in a family where I never thought when I was, swearing my oath in 2010 or when I was 15 or whatever, that I would ultimately end up being a plaintiff in the case against the president.
Right.
But I also didn't think we would have such absurd breakdown, frankly, in the rule of law in this country that allowed a completely illegal deployment of troops in circumstances like this, and a total breakdown in our constitutional system and our separation of powers. Again, in a system that I am sworn to defend per my commissioning oath. So I viewed it as, this isn't a radical action. This is the only action that's appropriate to take, because I don't have any other choice. You're taught in the military that you are obligated to disobey illegal orders. And that was the avenue that we went down with this lawsuit, was in a way, I guess, sort of self-preservation, because I thought that this was an illegal order. So if I actually thought that this was an illegal order, I should have stopped obeying any orders related to this conflict at that point. And I wasn't ready to do that, and because that's going straight to court-martial, and that would have been an interesting thing to see how that would have played out. But what Ackerman was presenting to me was the ability to ask a valid constitutional question whilst continuing my mission and continuing to be a leader to my soldiers. And so when the lawsuit dropped, I had 4 months left in my deployment. And they asked me if I wanted to go home, and I said, no, I want to stay here with my soldiers. Like, and they're like, well, I don't understand, because you obviously don't want to be here or whatever. And I was like, well, I don't want to, it's not that I don't want to be here. I mean, frankly, no one really wants to be in Kuwait for a year that I'm aware of. Like, but it's that, and no offense to Kuwait, obviously, but
I got what you meant. Right.
Yeah.
I understood.
So, it's not that I don't want to be here. It's that I want to be here under the right circumstances that are done the correct way. And at any point in any of this process, me being there under legal circumstances was as simple as Congress getting up and voting to authorize the conflict. They could have done that at any time. So they chose not to, and they chose not to because they're frankly political cowards, and they don't want to be on record for a tough war vote. And I find that just utterly disgusting morally, when you're going to send troops, or your inaction essentially is going to send troops into harm's way, and yet you cannot be bothered to go on record to vote either for or against the war. I don't even care. I'm not telling you how you should vote. There's arguments on both sides, but you are refusing to take that vote. And we lost guys while I was there. There was a number of KIA, and we had moments of silence on the ops floor, where they flashed the picture of these guys that were killed in raids and stuff like that. And, obviously it wasn't Iraq in 2006 or 7 where you're having body bags just flow back to the U.S., but there are casualties. And it's just, I just couldn't comprehend the political cowardice involved there.
Yeah, it's really kind of amazing. These people, they're unwilling to risk their political career, so they're going to put other people's lives at risk.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's how I felt about it.
That's the thing. I mean, in the worst case scenario for a lot of these politicians, just to be totally cynical, but it really is the truth, is the majority of them often end up going and working on K Street as a lobbyist and making even more money in the private sector. But again, they're just unwilling to just make a political stand on basically the most important issue that you can decide upon. So yeah, that really is stunning. So let me ask you, so what is basically the status of the lawsuit?
So basically now it's done. It was thrown out by the courts. So the progress that happened, the steps, was we sued originally in the DC District Court, and it was heard by a single judge there. So at that time, we submit our briefs, and then the Department of Justice, at that time it was the Obama administration, DOJ, submits their counter arguments, and you duel back and forth with these legal briefs for a while, and then the judge rules. Well, it was again a single judge, and she ruled basically that she was not going to rule on the merits of the case. So she wasn't going to say if I was right or wrong, or there was a violation of the War Powers Resolution occurring. She said that she was dismissing it on grounds of standing because it represented a political question doctrine situation, which is there's precedent for, I think, terrible precedent in some of it. But basically it's saying that the court cannot resolve this because it's a conflict between two branches of government. So if Congress and the executive it's a matter that needs to be resolved between the two of them. Well, our legal team made, in our arguments, and I think obviously I'm biased, but I think that there's a lot of validity to it. Ackerman and David Reams, who was my litigator, who did a fantastic job, both of them, in crafting these legal arguments. They said one of the points that they made was, no, this is a question of statutory interpretation. So the court's job is to interpret laws as written. So the War Powers Resolution is the law of the land. That's a statute that was passed in the 70s. So what we're asking you to do is a very simple thing that's clearly within the mandate of the judiciary, which is you have this plaintiff. He's saying that he's been issued an illegal order, and it's based on this law, the War Powers Resolution, and obviously, the Constitution itself, which reserves for Congress the right to declare war, and we want you to interpret that. So basically what she was saying was, well, I'm not going to interpret that. Like, that's not my job. So she dismissed it on those grounds, and they also dismissed it. So she also threw in there basically, he's not actively engaged in combat in Iraq, so he doesn't have standing. So that might be a thing too. It was very weak language. So from there, it went up to the next level, which is the DC Court of Appeals, and it goes to a 3-judge panel there. And the same thing, you have dueling briefs go back and forth. And in September of 2017, we had the opportunity to do oral arguments. So my legal team, represented by, again, David Reams and Bruce Ackerman, went in front of the DC Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel, and made the arguments with the Department of Justice. Now, one thing that came out of those oral arguments that should just terrify any American. And at this point, the Trump administration was in power. So the DOJ is now the Trump DOJ, right? Mm-hmm. Which it doesn't change the case because we were still, the mission is the same. Now, I've obviously long since deployed back from Kuwait at this point, but this is like 2 years. It had taken 2 years to work its way through the courts, and I'm now at this point out of the Army. But I'm still on what's called the Ready Reserve, which is basically they have you on a list and they can recall you. So we were using that as saying, well, he could still be sent back technically.
Right.
So one thing that was just a shocking moment in that courtroom that I think everybody sort of held their breath because there's some people in there and stuff. And so one of the judges who I thought was the most open-minded justice, it was a justice by the name of Griffith. He asked the question to the Department of Justice attorney. Basically, they were making the argument that an AUMF is not meant to be law, essentially. Like it's not open to interpretation. That's just handed off from Congress, and it's not the court's job to interpret any kind of limits on an AUMF. So that's absurd. And so Judge Griffith asked, well, I'm having a hard time understanding what you're saying. So are you saying that you cannot envision any scenario in which the post 9/11 AUMF, which is being cited as the legal authority for this mission, anywhere in the world? So say we're attacking India. I mean, he didn't say this, but this is basically what he was getting at. Just something that's obviously not related to Al-Qaeda in any way. I mean, ISIS is not related to Al-Qaeda, and that was absurd that they were using that in the first place. But do you see any way that it's appropriate that anyone could bring this case and say this is obviously not inside the legal authority of that AUMF as passed? And the DOJ lawyer had the audacity, and this is terrifying. He said, no, Judge, I don't see any limitation that would be appropriate for the judiciary to impose on an AUMF that's been passed by Congress. So he's basically saying there that if Congress passes an AUMF, every AUMF is by definition a blank check to go to war whenever the executive branch chooses. And that's terrifying.
Right. Oof, that's a lot there. So let me ask you this. I mean, obviously, the powers that be, I guess, have pushed that development down. Have you really taken maybe any other action that's maybe not quite so official, but I guess sort of like an activism role or something like that?
Yeah, I've tried to stay engaged on the issue. I've written, I think at this point, 5 or 6 op-eds for different publications. I was invited to speak at a conference at Notre Dame actually last year, which I really enjoyed. And I've actually was able to meet with somebody, Representative Walter Jones, who just passed away, by the way, who's been a champion on this issue, super principled. Whether you agree with his politics or not, he's been extremely principled on this issue and has been long saying that Congress has abdicated its responsibility in a really disgusting way on the war powers issue in general. And, I was able to meet with him in his office and speak to him. And so I tried to kind of engage a little bit politically with both parties, because this is a bipartisan issue. It's not a party thing. Representative Jones is a Republican, but and Rand Paul is famous in the Senate for voicing some of these arguments. But then on the left, you also have people like Barbara Lee, who was the sole person who voted against the post 9/11 AUMF because she foresaw a lot of this and how it's going to be used as a blank check. So I really respect that, and Ro Khanna, some of those guys on the left. So I've tried to kind of engage on that, and with mixed success. So we'll see what happens, but I definitely want to keep pushing forward on it, because I think this is, I think it's something that's not in enough Americans' consciousness of how dangerous this path is that we're going down, which is essentially just that we now have decided that we want a king in the U.S. Like, we think that we got rid of that in the 1700s, and the founding fathers said we don't want a single person to be able to take us to war and make that decision. Well, we've essentially gotten back to that now, and that's terrifying to me and not the way it's supposed to be. So
yeah, the checks and balances. I'm glad you mentioned the op-eds. That's actually, I've been trying to promote the last one that you wrote for the American Conservative. It's titled "Why I Sued My Commander-in-Chief, President Obama." And I actually kind of pulled aside a little bit of the language in there. I was kind of hoping to quote you here real quick. And sure. You wrote, "I have reflected on the decision by President Donald Trump to withdraw troops from Syria. Do I think his decision-making process was flawed? Yes. Do I fear for the Kurds who are caught between a hostile Turkey and dangerous Syrian regime? Very much so. Do I worry that the Islamic State remains potent and dangerous even in its admittedly weakened state? I do." So again, I think that some people can think that we're sort of veering off course, but again, this is all a very principled argument that you're making. It's not necessarily that you even disagree with, I guess, the mission, I guess we could say. And it's a really complex issue as far as these wars. But yeah, maybe if you would want to maybe expand a little bit upon that.
So, I mean, I'm glad that came across in the piece. So the way I would sum it up is just in one sentence is the process matters. Like the process matters. And if you don't think the process matters, and we just get into this loop of just, well, for expediency's sake, we'll do it this way and we'll let the executive do it. And that way Congress will not have to ever have any accountability. That's very dangerous, because I think it's a lot easier to take the nation from a state of peace to a state of war in any given operation or mission that you can name, when it's at the end of the day one person that making that decision, and not a collective body with fragmented power of 535 people. And that's why we set up the system to be that way in the first place. I mean, that's why. So it just seems ridiculous to me to say that the process doesn't matter. And yeah, you're right. Like I wasn't necessarily against the conflict in Iraq and Syria in a certain sense. I do think sometimes the threat was, like, to the American homeland may have been a little exaggerated, but I mean, I definitely saw enough in being an intelligence analyst in Kuwait to, I will put it this way, I didn't cry any tears for the guys that were dying in the strikes that we were doing over there. I mean, I'm not a pacifist, and there's some terrible people, in that organization doing terrible things every single day. And that's why I wrote that in that piece. And it's very difficult for me to say that, and know that I'm essentially advocating a position that's going to put the Kurds and the Iraqi army and Iraqi special forces that we fought alongside in Iraq and in Syria in a difficult position. But I just think that the ultimate danger is within on this issue. It's how we are veering away from our Constitution and what that can lead to inside of our own country. And we need to fix that first. And once we fix the process, then we can, have, and once we're able to have a discussion again in the proper way about what are our foreign policy objectives, that goes outside of just the executive branch, then we can move forward. But we're far from that point now because we've just gotten so far off track.
There's one thing I definitely wanted to ask you about. This was really in the back of my mind. So you've been fighting for this vote for so long, and then again, I see so much irony in the fact that recently the Senate voted against Trump's decision to withdraw troops from Syria and Afghanistan. It was a pretty bipartisan support. That it was like 70 to 26, and I was just kind of hoping you could comment your thoughts on that.
Well, I think in a way it's the height of hypocrisy, because you are sitting there in the Senate and you are now going to have the audacity to condemn the withdrawal of troops there. But where have you been for 3 years? I mean, there are notable exceptions. Rand Paul, Tim Kaine has put forward a number of AMFs. Tim Kaine has been a very eloquent critic of this and was one of the few that, as a Democrat, that criticized the Obama administration for this when it was obviously a Democratic president. But so I do think it's, in a way, the height of hypocrisy that the only time you can get a vote, actually, is when the executive branch is unilaterally withdrawing troops. I mean, now, again, I won't begrudge them their disagreement with the policy there. There are some good arguments for why we shouldn't precipitously withdraw from Syria. And again, I laid out what my concerns were that you mentioned in that tack piece that I wrote. But you don't get to do that and have any seriousness about it, to me. So yeah, it's pretty disgusting to see, and it's indicative too of where we are as a country, unfortunately, politically, where we have these partisan camps and people just can't think of things in terms of universal principles anymore. It's just, which party do I identify with, and I have to vote that way because I'm either voting for or against the president, either way. And again, I'm not pointing out either party here. They're both guilty of this.
Yeah, but I sort of more point the finger at the Democrats on this one. And the Democrats, or at least it's a general liberal principle, non-interventionist path is the better way. But the Democrats who are actually elected into office rarely really go that way. And I think a lot of it was just simply whatever Trump says, I'm going to be on the opposite side of it.
Right.
In my opinion.
Well, I would agree with you in the sense that I'm always more disappointed with the Democrats when they do this kind of thing. But it's also unfair for me so they actually had a vote on the Yemen conflict previously in the Senate, and this was a vote in the Senate, a resolution to withdraw support for the Saudis, who are doing all kinds of egregious things in Yemen, and we're supporting them in doing so. And you had three, I think, Republicans cross the aisle and voted to essentially to end the U.S. involvement there. One was Rand Paul, unsurprisingly. One was Mike Lee from Utah, who also has sort of a libertarian bent.
Sure.
And on some issues. And then I can't remember who the third one is. I should, because I follow these votes very closely, because I always want to provide kudos to people who actually show principle. So I keep up with the voting records. But those were the only three Republicans that crossed the aisle. Now, 11 Democrats at that time voted for staying in supporting the Saudis. But the whole rest of the Democrats in the Senate, so whatever that comes out to be, this was before the 2018 election, so whatever that comes out to be, like 38 Democrats voted to withdraw. So I can't necessarily say that I hold the Democratic. It seems like it would be hypocritical for me to point a disproportionate amount of the blame on the Democrats when they're voting 39. The majority of their caucus, at least on that particular vote, the vast majority is voting against it. Now, I'm extremely disappointed that 11 of them voted for staying, because if they had provided a united caucus with three Republicans crossing the aisle, that we'd be out of Yemen, or that resolution would have passed anyway. It would probably be vetoed. So I agree with you. I just think that I think both parties to a certain extent are culpable for the situation that we've got in, unfortunately.
And again, it's just purely my opinion, but I think a lot of, at least the little bit of progress that we've had on Yemen is really more related to the fact that Donald Trump really hasn't made much of a statement on it. And I think that there would be sort of this reactionary politics. Rand Paul basically said it right after the last vote. I don't remember exactly, but basically paraphrasing it, what's the one thing that brings Republicans and Democrats together? It's war.
I'd agree with him on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have a lot of interactions here with actual key decision makers. What do you think? I mean, I know there's a lot of factors, but what are the pressures that are pushing them in this sort of perpetual war direction?
I wouldn't say I have a lot of interaction. I met one rep and I actually had a chance to talk to Beto O'Rourke about it briefly on the side of one of his rallies as he was running for Senate, because he had voted he had signed a letter stating that he wanted an AUMF vote when he was in the House. Obviously, he's not in the House anymore. But
right.
The pressures that I think are creating this it's just a lack of political and policy imagination as to any other course that's acceptable. I think that it's been so long since we've had a true debate over what are the objectives of these wars that nobody knows what to do anymore except to just continue down the same course, because nobody wants the political culpability of pulling out troops and then having a group like ISIS or the Taliban in Afghanistan resurge and then be a threat to the U.S. homeland. And I understand that, but that is a necessary function for Congress to do. Like, they have a role in debating foreign policy objectives. That's not just the executive branch that's supposed to be doing that. And you can look at history. In the Vietnam War era, you had, I think it was Senator Fulbright, convened hearings in the late 60s or early 70s in which he was really questioning, some of the things that the Johnson or Nixon administration, again, my history is not exact on this, but I know that there were some panels called and there was more of a discussion about what was going on than what you see now. And that was a form of the legislative branch doing what it's supposed to do and asking hard questions and getting involved and saying, hey, if the executive branch cannot tell us what the end game is here, then we're going to tell you what the end game is, and this is not going to go on forever. So I think that that's what I'm trying to ultimately have happen again, is just, I don't have all the solutions, obviously, but I want to have a dialogue and I want to have the proper separation of powers again.
No, I fully agree. I mean, there's just, and you've experienced that, there's just so many forces that exactly where we're going to err on the side of war. I mean, I think you kind of touched upon it. It's just not a very safe, so sad to say, but it's just a much safer political position to rule in favor of war. You've also got a lot of financial conflicts of interest, from weapons and defense contractors. I mean, before we went on the air, we were talking about, Trump's basic stance on, cutting off weapons to Saudi Arabia. And I think we both kind of thought the same thing. We sort of appreciated the candor of Trump. Don't agree at all with his position, but the fact that he would just sort of say something that no president prior would openly admit. His predecessors were just a little bit more tactful and eloquent and dodging these sort of issues.
Yeah, I think he, at least, I mean, as disgusting as it was when he was talking about not wanting to pull out of our involvement in Yemen because we have lucrative weapons contracts with the Saudis, I mean, at least he's saying it. I mean, he's being transparent, because that has been and I was saying to you earlier, I don't know if the weapons deals and stuff are the proximate cause and the main cause for some of these wars or whatever, but they are a shaping factor, at least on the edges. And you can argue and debate a lot about how influential those actually are. And so in a way, as revolting as it was to hear that just incredibly immoral argument being made, At least it was out in the open. And I think that's what you're saying is, Obama or Bush or any of the other recent presidents, I guess, like that's always been present, but they would never acknowledge that.
And I know we've hammered away at how awful the system is. I do think it'd be kind of nice there is some positive news. And do you mind talking a little bit about what is happening with Yemen there?
Yeah. So a couple weeks ago, just over a week ago, the House passed a resolution basically saying that, they were not in favor of the United States continuing its support for the Saudis in Yemen, which is long overdue. I don't think we have any vital security interests there. And the Saudis are well documented to be doing, as I said, some egregious things there in terms of the way they conduct their strikes as not being precise. And, so I think it was Ro Khanna in the House who's got a history of really supporting these kind of resolutions and driving them forward that led the effort on this. So it passed the House, and I guess it'll go now to the Senate, where I'm not sure where it stands in the Senate yet, honestly, but I'm pretty sure it has not come up yet in the Senate, but I could be wrong. But the Senate, basically a lot because of the Khashoggi, just the totally egregious nature of the Khashoggi killing of the journalist that was killed in the embassy by the Saudis, where he's basically dismembered. There's some people in the Senate, even on the Republican side, that are getting pretty fed up with some of the antics of the Saudis. So it may be a right moment for that House resolution to make its way even through the Senate, despite Mitch McConnell's, I'm sure, backhanded best efforts to make sure it never sees the floor. But so I think that's definitely a light, sort of, and I'll take whatever victories I can take at this point. So
I feel the same way. I mean, exactly. We're pointing to all these different flaws in a system, and I'm guilty of it too. You can just almost become too cynical, and I've caught myself several times. That could never happen. That could never happen, because I focus so much on the conflicts of interest and just the different systemic issues, and then sometimes we do actually have some progress. So it's I got to take that cynic hat off from time to time and hand out credit when it's due.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I know you've had a cold and you fought through it, and I appreciate you doing this interview. Did you have any kind of final thoughts or anything you'd like to mention?
Well, I guess like sort of just to wrap it up and like on that note of kind of what you just said, that the thing that I would, because people sometimes will ask me like, well, what can I do on this issue? Well, main thing you can do is like write your representative. And I mean, I have another story that for another day about me going to a town hall with my representative, and we had a kid killed in my district that was an Army soldier in Iraq. And I wanted to sit there in the line and ask him to his face, this representative, can you explain to me why it is that one of your constituents from your district, who was 20 years old, I think, was killed in a war that you never could vote for or against? And he got very upset with me for that question. And I got very upset with him and ended up having to leave. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing, you got to make those guys uncomfortable. Now, fortunately, he had a sex scandal after that, and he's no longer in Congress. So, but that's
the one thing that can end a political career.
Yeah, exactly. But those are the questions. And if people ask me, what can you do? Write your senators, write your representatives, and then reward the ones who are on the right side of issues like this. The Barbara Lees, the Rand Pauls, and the Walter Joneses of the world, and acknowledge when they're taking a principled stand. And you have to pay attention to these voting records.
Well, awesome. I know you're definitely under the weather, and I appreciate you agreeing to do this interview under those circumstances. But more importantly, I appreciate the long and continued fight that you've been doing. It's very important work. I hope you keep doing everything that you're doing. And I guess lastly, I'd just like to thank the audience for listening. So please check out his article there. Share this with everybody you know. And I'd like to thank everybody who supports the podcast. You can share it on social media, give it a 5-star rating. But really the best way to support the podcast is actually to go out there and grab a copy of my 3-book series. It's called Rackets. It's on the legalization of drugs and gambling and the criminalization of prostitution. So until next time, thank you much.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000, plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross, of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone.